You have insulted my honour, sir, and I demand redress. Well, not you personally. I mean, I'd probably lose if I actually fought you. But it is the topic of today's video. Honor codes, what they offer you as a fantasy world builder, how to make them, how to break them. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If this kind of topic interests you and you'd like to help me keep making these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page or buy my books, links down below. Okay, let's get cracking. First, what is honor? So, at a very high level, honor can be defined as your value to society. It generally comes down to a set of codes that define how you should behave given a certain class or a certain set of skills that you hold. Often, this kind of honor-based society results in very intricate and stratified class levels and very intricate and stratified shows of respect. How deep you bow to people, how do you establish rank, how do you greet a superior, how do you greet an inferior, how do you say goodbye to people, even something as simple as giving gifts to each other and whether you can accept a gift or whether you can even offer a gift to somebody else. Honor often results also in shame being a thing in your society. Now, it is important to understand the difference here between shame and guilt. Guilt is when the law establishes that you are guilty of something. But shame is a much more subtle thing because you might not be guilty of one specific thing. You might be ashamed because you have failed your society. You have failed the tenets of your honor code. And your society might very well enforce that shame by putting pressure on you to behave in the way that the society expects you to behave in a way that garners honor. And that shame can be weaponized. The best way that I've seen that demonstrated is in Catherine Kerr's books, which are set in a sort of Celtic-inspired world. And in this world, you have bards who have basically freedom of speech in order to protect the people from lords who go too far. And these bards can create what are called flyting songs. Now, these flyting songs are basically satirical lambasements of a noble. So, for example, in one of her books, there's a noble called Otto who is not as generous as he should be. And there's a bard who crafts this flyting song about how Otto is such a miser that he even steals from his own peasants. And at one point, Otto does something that makes the king very angry. And the king gets the bard to stand up and sing this song in the great hall before all the people. And this causes Otto such shame that he actually starts plotting that bard's downfall, which is actually against the laws of Devery. If you harm a bard, you're hanged for it. So you can definitely weaponize shame in that fashion. And in fact, in the latest books by Catherine Kerr, The Sword of Fire, the book opens with a bard starving themselves to death on the steps of a lord's castle in protest to the lord ignoring flyting songs and ignoring the justice that the lord is supposed to bring to the people. And that kind of action also comes from our world. People have done it in the past, but it is actually where seppuku originated from. The Japanese tradition of killing yourself actually originated as a form of protest action. It's saying that my lord has given me an order that I believe to be against my honor. Now, I cannot disobey him by the tenets of Bushido, so I will kill myself in protest of these orders and bring shame to my lord's name. At least that was the originating principles. So when you're designing your honor code, think about shame and how it is enforced by the society around which this honor code exists. And if you like that discussion on shame and honor codes, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about actual specific honor codes. So in order to tackle the subject, I'm going to talk about the two famous ones from our world, the Chivalric Code and the Code of Bushido. Starting with the Chivalric Code, which was defined really in 1170 to 1220. Now, the Chivalric Code had its roots in the much older noble habitus. So let's first take a look at those virtues. The noble habitus code was forbearance, hardihood, liberality, honor, being a good ruler, protecting your people, not oppressing them, and loyalty. So you can see that these attributes were basically about being a generally okay dude and not oppressing the people under you. And they were an outgrowth, a kind of fusion between the Roman cultures and the Germanic cultures. And out of this noble habitus grew the actual chivalric code, which of course there were many codified versions of. I'm going to take the kind of generally established chivalric code elements, which is courage, justice, mercy, generosity, faith, nobility, and hope. You can see where those origins comes from. Nobility comes from the be a good ruler, or it's sometimes called the Davidic ethic from David from the Bible. And you can see generosity coming from the same place. Of course, loyalty is there, courage and justice, and all of these things around your conduct on the field of battle. A great example of this kind of code implemented in a fantasy world is, of course, Westeros from Game of Thrones. Now, what is really interesting about the way that George R.R. Martin did this is that the code is there. And there are people like Sir Loras who pay at least lip service to it. They at least look like they're obeying the code. And then there are people like Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, that clearly do not meet any of those virtues. And yet he remains a knight. Why? Because he doesn't care. The shame rolls off him. And that's the thing with these honor codes. If you have people who ignore the shame that they feel, the honor code starts breaking down. And that means that the society starts crumbling, because your society is not built on these strong laws. These are not enforceable strictures of law. They are things enforced by the society. The fabric of that society starts breaking down when you get people like the mountain that rides that just outright ignore all the codes and elements of the honor code that they're supposed to live by. Okay, so how does that contrast with Bushido? So Bushido comes from Japan, and it was the code that the samurai lived by. It was codified quite late, although it had an oral tradition going back a long way. The tenets of Bushido are integrity, respect, courage, honor, honesty and sincerity, duty and loyalty, and compassion. I am sure that you can see the thread between these, and I will talk about that more in a little bit. But first I want to talk about an implementation of the tenets of Bushido in fantasy, and that is Raymond E. Feist and Janie Wirtz's world of Tsurani, the Empire of Tsurani. Now the culture here is a very Eastern-based, very samurai-based culture. Shame can result in suicide, and it can be weaponized. In Daughter of the Empire, Mara, the main character, weaponizes suicide against her husband. So she makes her husband, she sets up a situation where her husband is so shamed he has to commit suicide. Even here, you can see the subversion of the elements of the culture, because this is where interpretation of honor is very important. And in the first book, we see this in the instance of Papaweu. So when Mara is grieving for her father and her brother dying on the world of Makemia, she goes into the contemplation glade where none but the family are allowed. And while she is there, she is attacked. Papaweu enters the glade, and he defends her from the assassin. He saves her life. But none are allowed to enter the glade who are not family during a period of mourning. And so Papaweu is supposed to be condemned to death. And he requests permission to commit suicide, and Mara says no, and everybody starts preparing to hang him, and she's like, no, that's not what I meant at all. He must wear the black rag of the condemned. So everybody can see that he's under a death sentence, but I'm not going to kill him now. What this allowed her to do is to keep her best warrior in service, even though technically he should have died. And that kind of fine, nuanced interpretation of honor is what makes that first book phenomenal. It is one of my favorite books in terms of exploration of politics and honor for that reason, for that very, very fine nuances. In the second book of that series, Servant of the Empire, Mara gets a slave from Mtkemia called Kevon, and they start boning each other, whatnot. And then there's this one incident where Kevin needs to pick up a sword to help defend Mara. And there are other people there, other people of rank there, and they're all like, that slave can't pick up a sword. And she's like, well, that slave just saved your life. Did you see him pick up a sword? Because I didn't. And that samurai's like, nope, I didn't see him pick up a sword. And they're all like, nope, didn't see him pick up a sword. And that kind of blindness is another indication of that kind of nuanced view of honor, that sometimes you have to look away. Sometimes you have to be blind to what's right before you. And you can actually see the difference between what, say, Gregor Clegane was doing, where he just outright ignored the codes, versus what was going on in the Empire of Tsurani, where Mara still played within the rules, but she threaded a very fine, delicate line of honor. And if you like that discussion of Bushido versus Chivalry, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about some other examples of using shame and what impact magic has. So first I want to talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender and Zuko's character arc. So when we meet Zuko, he is shamed. He's not guilty of anything. He didn't do anything wrong, but he did something that caused his father rage and shame, and his father exiled him for it. Now Zuko is trying to regain his honor, and that is his driving motivation. But through the story, Zuko learns that only he has his honor. You cannot give your honor away. It cannot be taken from you. You have your honor. And that lesson is then one that teaches him that he was never actually shamed. And that was a very interesting journey in terms of honor and shame and the driving force, and a character who doesn't overcome the original premise, but instead grows beyond the original premise to realize something deeper about his life as it was. So what you can say about Zuko is that shame drove him on his terrible path, but honor led him out the other side. The other element that I want to talk about, specifically applying to fantasy, is how honor codes are impacted by magic. And here I want to talk about D&D's paladins. So a D&D paladin has a code of honor that is enforced by their god. And if they stray away from that code of honor, they lose their power. And that is the impact of a real god driving a real set of behavior. So if Westerosi gods were real and knights had power based on their code of honor, Gregor Clegane would have lost his powers based on his behavior. And I think that it's very important to consider that in your world, especially if you have active real gods. If you have active real gods, why do people get away with breaking their honor codes if they do? Are the gods such that you can bargain with them? Can you thread a fine needle? Or do they look into your heart and see what you really mean? Or how does that relationship work between the gods and your honor code? And if you like that discussion of magic and honor codes, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about how to design your own honor code. So call me cynical, but you will have noticed that loyalty exists in both Chivalry and Bushido. And the reason why it is often regarded as the most important of the virtues, is because, of course, These things are enforced and driven by a society with somebody at the top who wants the people below them to be loyal to them. So 9 times out of 10, your honor code is going to have something about how you need to be loyal to the people above you, because that just is how the cookie crumbles in terms of the people above you figuring out the honor code. There's also likely going to be something about respect in the honor code, and that's probably going to drive some respectful behavior in your society, like how you greet people, how you say goodbye to people, how you establish rank, and so forth and so on. You're probably going to have something about honor itself, so the kind of code feeding itself with that honor. If it is a militant order that is governed by this honor code, you will have something about behaving with courage. If it is, say, an assassin's guild tied to this honor code, it'll probably be something connected to never getting caught or never revealing the secrets of the order or something like that. Some kind of conduct around which this honor code is built, how you must conduct yourself in the theater that this honor code governs. The rest of it kind of depends on your society. Let's say you're a very heavily religious society, you're probably going to have something about faith in there. Let's say that you are a more philosophical-based society, like the Neo-Confucius society that gave rise to Bushido, then you're probably going to have something about integrity in there. And quite often, you will have something about looking after the less fortunate in your society, just to kind of make the code appeal to the less fortunate in the society, so that they can look at that code and say, well, that's what the knights are supposed to be. They're supposed to be generous to us, and that's why we, the peasant population, give them our loyalty. So without that element, what you will too often find is that the lesser people become jammed in a box by oppressive overlords, and eventually they will rise up and overthrow the overlords, which obviously you don't want, so you want to have some measure of compassion in your honor code. Then very importantly, how is it enforced? Is it the shame and the peer pressure of society? Is there an actual court of honor where you have to go to defend yourself if you've been found guilty of honor breaches? Is it a magical code of honor? So something happens to you if you break your honor code, whether by God or by magic or some other means. And how do you redeem yourself if you fail? Is it a case of death before dishonor, and if you're dishonored, you commit suicide? Or is there a path to redemption, a quest you can undertake, a means by which you can cleanse yourself? So give some thought to the shame of failure and how you recover from that failure. So those are my thoughts on honor codes in fantasy worlds. Which honor code do you like best in a fantasy world? If you like this video, give it the thumbs up button. Maybe check out my video on when matriarchy makes sense in a fantasy world. And I will see you soon for another video from Just in Time Worlds.